The world held its breath this morning. In one of the most strategically volatile waterways on Earth, a sudden and highly consequential confrontation has unfolded, one that is already sending shockwaves through global markets, military command centers, and diplomatic channels. According to multiple emerging reports, the United States Navy has directly engaged Chinese-linked oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz. The details remain fluid, but early indications suggest a targeted interdiction operation. An aggressive move in a region where even the smallest miscalculation can spiral into a global crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is the narrow artery through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply flows every single day. Any disruption here is not regional, it is global. And now, for the first time in recent memory, two of the world's most powerful nations appear to be edging into direct confrontation in these waters. What makes this moment particularly alarming is not just the action itself, but the implications behind it. Why were Chinese tankers being targeted in such a sensitive zone? What intelligence prompted this response from the US Navy? And perhaps most critically, how will Beijing interpret this move? Because in geopolitics, perception often matters more than reality. If China views this as an act of economic warfare, or worse, a military provocation, the consequences could extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. Analysts are already warning that this incident risks triggering a chain reaction, drawing in regional powers, disrupting global energy flows, and escalating tensions between nuclear-armed states. Early market signals are already reflecting the uncertainty. Oil prices are showing signs of volatility. Shipping insurers are reassessing risk premiums. And behind closed doors, emergency consultations are likely already underway. But here's the deeper concern. This isn't happening in isolation. The Middle East is already a pressure point, strained by ongoing conflicts, proxy tensions, and fragile alliances. The presence of both US and Chinese interests in this region has long been a delicate balancing act. What we may be witnessing now is that balance beginning to fracture. And when that balance shifts, the consequences are rarely contained. In the coming minutes, we're going to break down exactly how this situation developed, what we know so far, and why this moment could represent a turning point, not just for US-China relations, but for the global order itself. If you want clear, fact-based analysis on the stories that shape our world, this is where we do it. Subscribe now because this situation is evolving fast and the next developments could be even more significant. To understand how a U.S. naval action against Chinese-linked tankers in the Strait of Hormuz became even conceivable, you have to step back, far beyond this morning's headlines, and examine the slow, accumulating pressures that have been building for years. Because this moment did not come out of nowhere. It is the product of overlapping tensions between Washington and Beijing, between global energy supply and geopolitical control, and within a Middle East that has become increasingly crowded with competing great power interests. For decades, the United States has maintained a dominant naval presence in the Persian Gulf. This posture was never simply about regional stability, it was about ensuring the uninterrupted flow of oil through critical choke points, especially the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, has long acted as the de facto guarantor of maritime security in these waters. China, for most of that time, remained a distant economic actor, dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but not directly involved in securing it. That has changed. Over the past 15 years, China's energy demands have surged dramatically. Today, Beijing is one of the largest importers of crude oil in the world, with a significant portion of that supply originating from the Gulf. As a result, China's strategic interests in the region have deepened, not just economically, but politically and increasingly militarily. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative further accelerated this shift, expanding its footprint across ports, infrastructure, and logistics corridors that stretch from Asia to the Middle East. While China has largely avoided overt military entanglement, its presence has become impossible to ignore. Now layer onto that a timeline of rising US-China rivalry. 2018-2020. Trade tensions escalate into a broader strategic competition. Sanctions, tariffs, and technology restrictions begin reshaping global alignments. 2021-2023. The rivalry expands into military signaling. Increased naval patrols in the South China Sea are mirrored by a more assertive U.S. presence in key global choke points, including the Gulf region. 2024-2025. Energy security becomes a central battleground. As global markets face volatility, from sanctions regimes to supply disruptions, control over shipping routes gains renewed importance. Reports begin surfacing of closer Chinese coordination with Gulf oil producers, including long-term supply agreements that bypass Western financial systems. At the same time, tensions in the Middle East continue to simmer. Iran remains a central player, geographically positioned along the Strait of Hormuz and politically opposed to U.S. influence. Periodic incidents involving tanker seizures, drone surveillance, and naval standoffs have kept the region on edge. Each incident adds another layer of unpredictability. Now bring these threads together. In recent weeks leading up to this incident, there have been increasing reports of heightened naval activity in the Gulf. U.S. forces conducting expanded patrols, regional allies on alert, and, notably, a rise in shipping movements tied to non-Western energy networks, including vessels reportedly linked to Chinese supply chains. Then, suddenly, this morning, a direct U.S. naval response targeting Chinese-linked tankers. If confirmed, this marks a sharp escalation from economic competition to physical interdiction in one of the most sensitive corridors on the planet. And that raises a critical question. Was this a preemptive move based on intelligence? Or the culmination of mounting friction finally crossing a threshold? Because if this is not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a pattern, then what we are witnessing is not just a confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz. It may be the early stages of a much larger strategic shift. What exactly happened in the Strait of Hormuz this morning? At this stage, the answer depends heavily on who you ask, because, as with most high-stakes geopolitical incidents, the facts are still emerging, and the narratives are already diverging. According to initial U.S. defense sources, the operation was a targeted maritime interdiction. American naval assets reportedly identified a group of oil tankers transiting the strait under what officials described as irregular routing patterns and non-compliant signaling behavior. In a region where vessel tracking and identification protocols are tightly monitored, such anomalies immediately raise red flags. U.S. officials claim the tankers were linked to sanctioned energy networks, potentially involving illicit oil transfers designed to bypass international restrictions. The stated objective, according to these sources, was not to provoke, but to enforce maritime law and prevent what they characterize as unauthorized or destabilizing economic activity. From this perspective, the move was procedural, firm, but justified. However, the description of events becomes far more complex when examining how the situation unfolded on the water. Reports indicate that U.S. naval vessels issued multiple radio warnings to the approaching tankers, requesting identification verification and compliance with standard maritime protocols. When those warnings allegedly went unanswered, or were only partially acknowledged, U.S. forces escalated their posture. Surveillance drones were deployed overhead. Naval ships maneuvered into interception positions. At least one tanker was reportedly physically halted, though details on whether force was used remain unclear. And that's where the uncertainty begins. Because from the Chinese perspective, the narrative shifts dramatically. Early statements from sources aligned with Beijing describe the incident as an unjustified interference with commercial shipping. According to these accounts, the tankers were operating within international law, carrying legally purchased crude oil, and posed no threat that would warrant military intervention. Chinese-linked analysts argue that the U.S. action represents a dangerous overreach, one that blurs the line between sanctions enforcement and direct economic coercion. Some have gone further, suggesting that this could be interpreted as a strategic signal aimed at restricting China's energy lifelines. Two competing interpretations, each with serious implications. So what evidence do we actually have? Satellite tracking data confirms unusual naval clustering in the strait during the timeframe of the incident. Commercial shipping logs show at least one vessel slowing significantly or altering course. However, no independent verification has yet confirmed the exact sequence of actions taken by either side. There are also key unknowns. Were these tankers directly flagged under international sanctions, or merely suspected? Did the vessels intentionally ignore U.S. warnings, or was there a communication breakdown? And perhaps most importantly, was this an isolated enforcement action or part of a broader operational directive? Because intent matters. If this was a limited interdiction tied to sanctions compliance, the situation, while serious, may remain contained. But if this was a deliberate strategic move targeting Chinese energy flows, then the implications expand dramatically. Military encounters at sea are inherently risky. They unfold in real time, under pressure, and often with incomplete information. A single misjudgment, a misread signal, a delayed response, can escalate a situation far beyond its original scope. And right now, one thing is clear. Both sides are watching closely. Both sides are interpreting the same event through entirely different lenses. And in that gap between perception and reality is where escalation begins. To understand why this incident carries such weight, you have to look beyond the ships themselves and focus on where this is happening. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another maritime passage. It is one of the most critical strategic choke points on the planet. At its narrowest, the strait is only about 21 miles wide. Within that space, two shipping lanes, each just a few miles across, handle the transit of roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption. Every day, massive tankers move through this corridor, carrying crude from the Gulf's largest producers toward global markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. There is no easy alternative route. If this passage is disrupted, even partially, the ripple effects are immediate and global. Energy prices spike, shipping costs surge, supply chains tighten, entire economies begin to feel the pressure within days. Now place this geography into a military context. For the United States, maintaining control, or at least influence over this corridor, has long been a cornerstone of its global security strategy. The U.S. Navy's presence here is not symbolic. It is operational, persistent, and designed to ensure that no single actor can dominate or disrupt the flow of energy. This includes deterring regional threats, particularly from Iran, whose coastline runs along the northern edge of the strait. Over the years, Iran has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to harass, delay, or threaten shipping traffic, using fast attack craft, mines, and missile systems positioned along the coast. The U.S. response has been clear: maintain overwhelming maritime superiority. But now, there's a new dimension: China. While Beijing does not maintain a permanent naval presence in the strait comparable to the U.S., its strategic dependence on this route is profound. A significant portion of China's imported oil passes directly through these waters. Any disruption here doesn't just affect global markets, it directly impacts China's economic stability. That creates a vulnerability. And in geopolitics, vulnerabilities often become pressure points. From a strategic standpoint, the ability to monitor, influence, or restrict access to such a critical corridor carries enormous leverage, not necessarily through outright closure, but through selective enforcement, inspection regimes, or increased operational risk. That is why this incident matters. If the U.S. is signaling a willingness to directly intervene in shipping linked to Chinese supply chains, it introduces a new layer of strategic competition, one that moves beyond tariffs and trade disputes into the physical domain of global logistics. It also raises operational questions. Will China begin escorting its own tankers through the strait? Could we see an increased Chinese naval presence in the Gulf? How might regional actors respond to a visible shift in great power dynamics within their waters? Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just about oil, it is about control, it is about access, and ultimately, it is about influence over the global economic system. And once multiple major powers begin asserting that influence in the same narrow space, the margin for error becomes dangerously small. This is no longer just a regional security issue. It is a test of how far competing powers are willing to go to secure their strategic lifelines, and what risks they are prepared to accept in the process. As governments move cautiously in their public statements, the most immediate and unfiltered assessments are coming from the intelligence and analytical community, where the language is often more direct and the concerns more sharply defined. According to early intelligence-linked assessments, this incident is unlikely to be accidental. Analysts point to the level of coordination required for a maritime interdiction in such a congested and sensitive corridor. The deployment of surveillance assets, the positioning of naval vessels, and the decision to engage all suggest prior authorization at a high operational level. In other words, this was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a calculated move. But calculated for what purpose? One school of thought within defense analysis circles argues that this action fits into a broader U.S. strategy of selective pressure, targeting critical nodes in rival supply chains without escalating to open conflict. From this perspective, the interception of Chinese-linked tankers could be interpreted as a signal, a demonstration that, in times of heightened tension, key maritime routes remain under U.S. oversight. Control of choke points has always been a form of strategic leverage, one senior maritime security analyst noted. What's new here is who that leverage is being applied against. Other experts, however, caution against overinterpreting intent. Some intelligence professionals suggest that the operation may have been driven by sanctions enforcement priorities, particularly if the cargo or ownership structures of the tankers were linked, directly or indirectly, to restricted entities. In this view, the involvement of Chinese-linked vessels may be incidental rather than intentional, a byproduct of complex global energy networks where ownership, flagging, and financing often span multiple jurisdictions. But even if that is the case, perception remains the central issue. Because in Beijing, the interpretation may be very different. Geopolitical analysts specializing in China's strategic doctrine warn that any action perceived as interference with energy security is likely to be taken seriously, regardless of the stated justification. China's leadership has consistently framed access to energy resources as a core national interest, and disruptions, especially those involving military actors, can quickly escalate in political significance. There is also growing discussion within policy institutes about the risk of normalization. If such interdictions become more frequent, whether by the U.S. or other powers, it could establish a precedent where major economies begin asserting control over shipping flows in contested regions. That, in turn, increases the likelihood of confrontation, particularly if multiple navies operate with overlapping mandates. Military analysts are also closely watching force posture. Satellite imagery and open-source intelligence are being scrutinized for any signs of additional deployments, whether U.S. reinforcements, regional naval mobilizations, or potential Chinese movements beyond their traditional operating areas. Even subtle shifts in positioning can signal intent. And then there's the question of escalation pathways. Experts in conflict dynamics often emphasize that incidents like this rarely escalate in a straight line. Instead, they evolve through a series of responses: diplomatic, economic, and sometimes military, each shaped by domestic pressures and strategic calculations. Escalation doesn't require intent, one analyst observed. It requires interaction. Right now, that interaction is just beginning. And while official statements may remain measured, the underlying assessments from intelligence and defense communities suggest a shared concern. This is not just about what happened in the Strait of Hormuz today. It is about what this incident could signal for the future of great power competition, where economic lifelines, military presence, and geopolitical influence increasingly intersect in the same contested spaces. But the other side has a point. While much of the initial analysis has focused on the potential for escalation and strategic signaling, there is a competing interpretation, one that challenges the assumption that this incident represents a deliberate shift toward confrontation. From this perspective, the event in the Strait of Hormuz may be less about great power rivalry and more about the complex, often opaque nature of global energy logistics. International oil shipping is not as straightforward as it appears. Tankers frequently operate under flags of convenience, ownership structures are layered across multiple jurisdictions, and cargoes can change hands several times before reaching their final destination. In such an environment, determining whether a vessel is in violation of sanctions or acting entirely within legal bounds is not always clear-cut. Supporters of this view argue that the U.S. Navy's actions may have been based on incomplete or time-sensitive intelligence. Faced with uncertain data and the risk of allowing potentially sanctioned cargo to pass unchecked, commanders may have opted for enforcement first, clarification later. In that sense, what appears externally as a geopolitical flashpoint could internally be viewed as a procedural enforcement decision, one made under pressure, with limited room for hesitation. There is also the diplomatic dimension to consider. Despite rising tensions, both Washington and Beijing have strong incentives to avoid direct military confrontation, especially in a region as sensitive as the Persian Gulf. Trade interdependence, global market stability, and domestic economic priorities all act as constraints on escalation. Some policy analysts suggest that behind the scenes, communication channels are likely active. Quiet diplomatic engagement, through back channels, intermediaries, or multilateral forums, may already be working to clarify intent and prevent misinterpretation. And then there is the question of signaling, not to each other, but to third parties. In a region where multiple actors are constantly testing boundaries, the U.S. may be aiming to reinforce its role as the primary enforcer of maritime norms. Demonstrating readiness to act, even in ambiguous situations, can serve as a deterrent to others who might consider exploiting legal or operational gray areas. From this angle, the incident is not about China specifically, but about maintaining credibility and consistency in enforcement. At the same time, critics of the alarmist interpretation caution against prematurely framing this as a step toward large-scale conflict. They point out that maritime incidents, while serious, have historically been managed without escalating into broader confrontations. Encounters at sea, they argue, are part of an ongoing pattern of friction in contested regions. Most are resolved through a combination of diplomacy, clarification, and, when necessary, quiet de-escalation. But even within this more restrained interpretation, there is an underlying acknowledgement. The margin for miscalculation is real. Because even if the initial action was procedural, even if the intent was limited, the outcome depends on how it is perceived and how the next move is made. And in a geopolitical environment already shaped by competition and distrust, perception can shift faster than policy. So while this may not yet be a crisis by design, it remains a situation with the potential to become one, if interpretations harden and responses begin to stack. The difference between containment and escalation may come down to what happens next. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz rarely stays in the Strait of Hormuz. Because this narrow corridor is not just a regional passage, it is a central artery of the global economy. And when tension rises here, the consequences extend far beyond naval strategy or diplomatic messaging. They reach directly into markets, governments, and everyday lives. The most immediate impact is economic. Even the perception of instability in the strait can trigger volatility in global oil prices. Traders respond not only to confirmed disruptions, but to risk itself. If shipping through the corridor is seen as less secure, insurers raise premiums, transport costs increase, and supply chains begin to tighten. That cost does not remain abstract. It moves rapidly into fuel prices, manufacturing costs, and inflation across multiple sectors. For major economies, including the United States, Europe, and large parts of Asia, higher energy costs can slow growth, strain household budgets, and complicate monetary policy decisions. And for countries heavily dependent on imported energy, the effects can be even more immediate. But the economic dimension is only one layer. There are also military consequences. Incidents like this often lead to increased force readiness. Naval deployments may be reinforced, surveillance operations expanded, rules of engagement reviewed and, in some cases, adjusted. Each of these steps is designed to manage risk, but they also increase the density of military activity in an already crowded space. More ships, more aircraft, more interactions under high-stakes conditions. And with each additional presence, the probability of unintended encounters rises. Then there is the geopolitical impact. For China, this incident touches on a core vulnerability: reliance on external energy routes. Any indication that these routes could be influenced or constrained by another power introduces strategic uncertainty. That may accelerate efforts to diversify supply lines, deepen regional partnerships, or expand naval capabilities beyond traditional areas of operation. For the United States, the situation reinforces its long-standing role as a security provider in the Gulf, but also places it at the center of a more complex strategic environment where actions are scrutinized not just by regional actors, but by global competitors. Allies and partners are also watching closely. NATO members, Gulf states, and other stakeholders must assess how this development affects their own security calculations. Does it signal a shift toward more assertive enforcement, or an emerging pattern of great power competition in shared spaces? And then there is the broader question of global alignment. Events like this can influence how countries position themselves, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. In a world already experiencing fragmentation, even a single incident can contribute to longer-term shifts in cooperation and trust. But perhaps the most important connection is the one closest to home. Because for viewers, this is not just about distant naval movements. If energy prices rise, it affects transportation, heating, and everyday expenses. If markets react, it influences jobs, investments, and economic stability. If tensions escalate, it shapes the global environment in which all of these systems operate. In other words, the implications are not confined to policy briefings or military strategy rooms. They are woven into the systems that underpin daily life. And that is why moments like this matter, not only because of what has happened, but because of what they set in motion. The next phase of this situation will be defined not by what has already occurred, but by what each side chooses to do in response. At present, multiple developments are likely unfolding behind closed doors. Diplomatic channels between Washington and Beijing are expected to be active, even if not publicly acknowledged. Maritime authorities in the Gulf are likely reviewing vessel data, communication logs, and surveillance footage to establish a precise timeline of events. At the same time, energy markets are digesting incomplete information, reacting in real time to uncertainty rather than confirmed fact. In the immediate future, three key areas will determine the trajectory of this incident. First, clarification from official sources. Whether the U.S. releases detailed justification for the interdiction, and whether China formally identifies the vessels involved as commercial, sanctioned, or otherwise, will shape the narrative moving forward. Second, maritime activity in the strait itself. Any increase in naval presence, escort operations, or shipping rerouting will be closely monitored as indicators of escalation or containment. Third, diplomatic signaling. Statements from foreign ministries, defense departments, and international partners will reveal whether this remains an isolated enforcement action or begins to evolve into a broader political dispute. At this stage, what is confirmed is limited. There was a U.S. naval response in the Strait of Hormuz. Chinese-linked tankers were involved in the encounter, and the situation has generated immediate geopolitical and market concern. What remains uncertain is far more significant. The exact legal basis for the interception, the intent behind the operational decision, and whether this incident will remain contained or become a reference point in a larger pattern of strategic competition. From here, two primary scenarios emerge. In the first scenario, diplomatic engagement succeeds in de-escalating tensions. Clarifications are issued, procedural explanations are accepted, and the incident is reframed as a maritime enforcement action within existing norms. Naval activity stabilizes, and markets gradually adjust. In the second scenario, interpretations harden. Each side views the incident through a strategic lens, leading to increased naval caution, expanded escort operations, and heightened sensitivity in future encounters. Even without direct conflict, the operational environment becomes more tense, more monitored, and more prone to miscalculation. Neither outcome is guaranteed. What is certain is that the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most strategically sensitive corridors in the world, and even minor disruptions here can have disproportionate global consequences. And so, the world watches. Not because a single event defines the future, but because it may signal how that future is beginning to shift. The question now is not just what happened, it is what happens next, and whether this moment becomes a footnote in maritime enforcement history or the opening chapter of a broader geopolitical realignment. If you want continued updates and deep dive analysis on global breaking developments like this, make sure you're subscribed. Because in situations like this, the story does not end, it evolves.